Conclusion. Today, I want to start by reading a land acknowledgement specific to the Auraria campus. Um, Acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of Indigenous peoples is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of Indigenous peoples over time. Land acknowledgement statements can help to remind us of the history, the contributions, and sacrifices Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zoni, Hopi, among others. We must recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, and as these words are spoken and heard, remember the ties these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respect to the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. Now, this land acknowledgement was provided by the Director of American Indian Student Services, Gracie Redshirt Tyon, but I would also like to acknowledge the forced removal of BIPOC communities who did occupy the area of the Auraria campus before it was created. So the next thing I wanted to go over is just some guidelines to kind of frame our conversation today. And I'll also be putting these in the chat, so you're welcome to reference them throughout our discussion. But if you have any questions or comments that come up during the presentation that you'd like to be shared with the presenters or the group, please chat them privately to me, and I will introduce them in our Q&A segment after our presentations are over. So the first one is I will lean into conversations. I will believe everyone is doing their best. I will critique ideas, not people. I will use I statements. I will accept a lack of closure. I will not make assumptions about other people's identities. I will take care of myself and take breaks if I need to. I will agree that what is shared here stays here and what is learned here leaves here. Now, once again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to privately chat them to me. I'm going to put our guidelines in the chat here. Alrighty, there they are. So since people are their best experts, I'm going to hand the microphone off to our first presenter for today, which is M. Alves. Take it away, M.
Hi, y'all. Really excited to be here. My name is M. Alves. I'm the Violence Prevention Education Coordinator at the Phoenix Center at Auraria, which is your on-campus interpersonal violence support and education office. So I'm going to just share my screen here and make sure that we're all ready from presenter mode. So if someone could also confirm that you can't see my notes, that'd be appreciated.
When your screen pops up, I'll let you know. Alrighty, I see your presentation.
Awesome. Wonderful. So today I'm going to be talking about exoticism and fetishization and tracing colonialism to sexual violence today. This is a really big topic, so I'm really tackling a lot in 30 minutes. It's definitely going to be a lot, so please feel free to ask any questions if anything is not clear during the Q&A portion. But before I get started, I want to just provide a trigger warning for sexual violence, colonization, white supremacy, and racial violence. Please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Whatever works for you works for me. And then before I dive in, I'll also tell you a little bit about the Phoenix Center before I dive into the roadmap. So the Phoenix Center at Auraria is your on-campus interpersonal violence support and education office. So what that means is that we come in to events like this and provide education and workshops like the one I'm about to be doing. But we also have our advocacy services. And I've put in the chat how to contact the advocacy services if you're in need of support today. So I've put the number for our 24/7 helpline. So if you are in need of a grounding technique, if you're feeling activated or triggered by any of the material today, then call that and a trained advocate will be on the other line. And we'll also be able to get you an appointment with one of our in-office advocates, which is virtual at this time, so that you're able to have a person to talk to who is confidential, does not require reporting of your experience of interpersonal violence, which is sexual violence, relationship violence, or stalking, or if you were supporting someone who is going through those things, those different violences. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start us with a roadmap. So it's going to begin with a review of some of what I think are like the key points, or some of the key points from the previous presentations that I'm going to be referring back to today. And then we're going to go into Black fetishization, Latinx fetishization, and Indigenous fetishization, and then trans women of color and fetishization, and then kind of talk about how that impacts porn and fetish porn and kind of what the impact that has on society. And then going into contemporary examples of how fetishization ultimately leads to a variety of violence for marginalized people. And then if we have time, I do have a video that sort of begs the question, and I'm not totally sure it answers the question, but does beg it. Can fetish be reclaimed and subverted? So as I mentioned, the review. So some of the key points from the previous presentations are that Black women are often portrayed as lascivious and insatiable, while white women are portrayed as markers of purity. The fetishization of Asian women is often based in the stereotype of submission. Fetishization and hypersexualization tend to go hand in hand, and it's a tool of imperialism and colonization. Ultimately, fetishization is often framed as a compliment, but really it's based in combined words there, flattening and homogenizing complex and nuanced individuals. And it's rooted in othering and stereotypes. And really ending on this point of just because something isn't in the forefront of our minds does not mean we're not affected by the dominant narrative. So just because you're saying I have a preference, that doesn't mean I have a fetish. We can't really separate those things from each other because we don't live in a vacuum. And so we're going to be going over some of the history here and what the dominant narrative and rhetoric is that is often used as a justification for violence. So to cover Black American fetishization, which, as I said, these are really big topics, and I'm not going to be covering every single nuance within these topics. I'm going to be doing a pretty good overview, so please keep in mind any questions. We have to really go back to the history of colonial European exploration itself, which when you look at the accounts for colonial European exploration, it often invokes this rhetoric that is normally associated with women. So often referring to the land as virgin land, ready for the conquering of European men, and thus sexualizing and feminizing the land itself, which then can be used for manifest destiny. So something that is also important to mention here is that not only were colonial European explorers really focused on sexualizing the land, but they also had these tales of African men as having giant penises and African women as having sex with apes. And these stories were presented as fact and influenced how Europeans saw Africans going forward. So ultimately, when chattel slavery is introduced, pseudoscientific investigations were used to portray Black people as subhuman and sexually inferior, and therefore justify the institution of slavery. They're portrayed as hypersexual and deviant, which is, again, a dehumanization, and really coming back to the point that fetishization is ultimately a tactic of dehumanization. So I also want to highlight this quote from Thomas Jefferson, which is from his book on the state of Virginia, where he states, more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. So he's really putting into literally the history books, the hypersexualized nature of the Black woman as he sees it. So he's portraying the Black woman as very hypersexual, not discriminating in her choices of sexual partners, and having an unlimited and undiscriminating sexual capacity, which really paved the way for a rape culture within the framework of American slavery. It viewed African women as sexual commodities rather than as human beings with sexual agency. And because Darwinism was really the popular theory at the time, social Darwinism, this was portrayed as an inherent quality. And ultimately, this also shows within the institution of slavery, breaking up families is pretty commonplace in order to gain an economic benefit. And it doesn't matter if they have relationships, because they can't have relationships, according to Thomas Jefferson, according to the popular thought at that time. And forcing enslaved people to engage in intercourse is therefore not a moral issue to them because there is no difference to them. So really taking out any chance of sexual agency that these human beings have. So enslaved Black women were often referred to as breeders, measuring the worth of Black women as economic and reproductive property. So that they themselves as property, but then their reproductive system and anything, any human being coming out of it being the property of enslavers. And so US slavery created conditions in which the sexual exploitation and rape of Black enslaved women was commonplace. What's really important to recognize here is that there were laws protecting white girls and children from statutory rape at the time, but that did not exist for enslaved Black girls and children. So the laws that did exist also often existed to protect the white enslaver and portray the enslaved as the seducers. And I really want to highlight here that within the institution of slavery, there cannot ever be true consent. So the idea of enslaved women being seducers, it's a logical fallacy. It doesn't make sense. And oftentimes, those laws on the books were there to discourage miscegenation and protect racial purity. Ultimately, it's also really important to mention here that Black girls and children were not really seen as girls and children, as young children. They were often adultified. And then in the US, racial status was inherited through the mother, making it possible that enslavers could both sexually exploit and rape their property, but could literally make economic gains through their violence, through selling their offspring. Sorry, just trying to get to the next page. So this really continues on even after the institution of slavery is ended. There are still different ways that Black women's autonomy and sexuality is being controlled. Black women are still portrayed as unregulated animals in their sexual desires, which really led to a paternalistic eugenics and sterilization movement. I'm sure many of us have heard of Mississippi appendectomies. And as recently as somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, on the East Coast, there was a judge who, for instance, was routinely offering women in the prison industrial complex a shortening of their sentences if they agreed to sterilization. So ultimately, this is really, reproductive control is sexual violence. And we really need to understand it as that and as a continuation of the control over Black bodies, and in particular, Black women's bodies that the state is enacting. And of course, I also want to harken back to the earlier presentations that mentioned Sarah Baartman. In the 1940s, Sarah Baartman was a South African woman, and she was literally paraded around on display. People would touch her body, and following her death, her body was dissected and put on display, and she was not returned to her rightful home until 2002. So this long history of the fetishization, hypersexualization, and lack of legal protection of Black women is still pervasive in how rapists and larger society view Black women as a legitimate victim and therefore unrapeable. Perpetrators of sexual assault against Black women are more likely to have their charges reduced as compared to those who assaulted white women. So we can't act as if these things aren't having real consequences, despite what our laws say. Even though our laws are no longer explicitly racist, they're often applied in a way that is very racist. And so it's the combination of the adultification, hypersexuality, and hypermasculinization and fetishization that creates an environment in which sexual violence against Black women and Black folks generally is accepted. Something I also really want to mention here is that it's important to notice that the sexual violence perpetuated in the name of white supremacy is often projected within the United States by white supremacists onto the Black community. So I'm thinking about the case of Emmett Till, where in the American imagination, Black boys and men are seen as threats to the sexuality of white women, which is a projection of how enslaved Africans within the United States and their descendants have actually had the sexual violence committed on them. And this projection by the white imagination is often used to justify historical lynchings and contemporary lynchings today. So now moving on to Latinx fetishization. So Latinx fetishization is often, and I'm going to be switching between Latinx and Latina. I personally identify as Latinx, but I've been socialized as a woman, and so Latina also fits under my experiences. So it's often based in comparisons to food and portraying Latinas as consumable. And it's really hard to me to also separate this from the way that Latin America has also exported a lot of their foods into other nations to the detriment of the folks living in those nations. And of course, this is like a whole conversation about globalization, and globalization can also be tied to sexual violence, but that's kind of another presentation. And then Latinas are also portrayed as spicy, specifically fetishizing their anger, and in my opinion, particularly fetishizing their resistance. When it comes to fetishizing Latinas, it's also homogenizing the community to a certain look. And that look is one that is racially ambiguous, but points to proximity to whiteness. And I really want to mention here that I'm really focusing on the US context here. Because within Latin America, I think that this does look different. I think that within the United States, when you are racially ambiguous and you have that proximity to whiteness, you are fetishized. But then I also think of the experiences of Indigenous and Black women within Latin America who are routinely experiencing fetishization and the heightened violence that comes with that within their communities. And so it's important to also mention that when you're fetishizing that racial ambiguity, you're fetishizing a flattened idea of what indigeneity and Blackness look like. And you're also flattening those ideas within the Latinx community overall. And this is all inextricable from colonialism and slavery, because all of those things happened in Latin America. In a way, and this is something that I think follows my own personal experience, fetishizing racially ambiguous people is in a way fetishizing colonization, because in Latin America, part of the success of colonization was that racial mixing. And so even though I may be fetishized within the United States as an other, I actually look like the dominant person in my country, my countries of origin. Which is, well, in one of my countries of origin, which is Puerto Rico. I also really want to tie back that oftentimes when it comes to the fetishization of Latinas, it's also often at the expense of non-Latinx Black women and completely erases Black Latinx women from our community overall, as if they don't exist. And this is something that I think that we should all be challenging, because I think part of how this comes up is that Latinas are viewed in some ways as more family oriented and submissive. And so that is juxtaposed with the ways that Black women are fetishized as insatiable, lascivious, and in particular, we're often portrayed as hypersexual and overly romantic, as a way to other Latinas and bolster the white heteronormative nuclear family as the ideal. This is really all to say that, like, in some portions of fetishization, I really believe are used to pit communities against each other. And then the Latina hashtag is often used as a tag for Latina porn, making the using of the hashtag of your identity fraught in social media. Before Tumblr banned porn, which feels like a very long time ago now. But before Tumblr banned porn, you really couldn't be in the Latina tag without just nonstop, pretty hardcore fetish porn. Pretty violent, and it led to a movement of young Latinas flooding that tag with selfies and saying things like, you know, I'm not your fetish. So next, I want to talk about Indigenous fetishization. So really want to look back to that very popular European exploration narrative of a feminized and sexual land, feminized and sexualized land that is essentially for the taking of European conquerors. Indigenous nations are often matrilineal and matrilocal, and so it's also really hard to separate Indigenous peoples from the lands, and that disrupting the connection to the land, disrupting the connection to their matrilineal lines, to the matrilocal configuration of their societies, can also be a way for them to enact racism and settler colonialism. So it's really important to notice that sexual violence, it's not only a consequence of patriarchy or white supremacy, it's how you enact racism and settler colonialism. In particular, one of the things I want to mention from the missionary diaries, and there's many, many things I could mention here, is that during the Trail of Tears period, many missionaries had accounts, and they talked about how soldiers would come and take Native women away from the community, assault them, and then return them to begin the march the next morning. So all of this is in an attempt to disrupt Native society as a whole, and that it's a tool for racial domination in the context of colonialism, which continues on to this day. So because stereotypes are such a big part of how fetishization comes to be, I just want to also mention here that when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about 500 plus Indigenous nations on Turtle Island, and that any stereotype, any fetishization flattens the identities of all of those unique nations and cultures. And I really want to talk about the legal loophole that leads to the statistic on that second bullet point, which is that 97% of Native women experience violence from a member outside of their race or tribal affiliation. So the legal loophole is that non-Native perps are not held accountable in tribal courts, or if they are, there's a maximum sentencing placed on all crimes with almost no jurisdiction for non-Natives. And so when a crime happens on tribal grounds, then there may not be any means for accountability. There is the possibility of going to the federal government because some of that loophole has been a bit closed. And unfortunately, the federal government has low funding. The conviction is the conviction rates are low, and cases are also just often declined. And we're also asking survivors to then engage in a system that has been colonizing them for centuries in order to get some measure of justice, without even really acknowledging that settler justice may not match their sense of justice. Another thing to really mention here is that Native women are one of the most victimized and have the highest rates of intermarriage, which means that this loophole is a big problem. So that leaves a huge loophole for if you are living in a relationship with your non-Native partner living on reservations. You may not be able to safely leave that partner or get any means of accountability, right? So again, Native women have the highest rates of intermarriage, and that is leaving a lot of Native women out to dry. So the fetishization and the legal loopholes has led to the continued dehumanization of Native women and leading to the epidemic of murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls. And I also want to really mention that sometimes when we talk about fetishization, I think we do it in a way that makes it sound as though the people who are actually experiencing the fetishization are not aware of it. But one of the studies that I looked into was a qualitative study that looked at accounts from Indigenous girls. And one of the things that they really mentioned is that they feel invisible outside of these stereotypes, and that the only time that Native women are visible is when they are murdered or missing. And that has huge mental health effects, huge. Another example of just how society reacts to the issue of fetishization and stereotypes and the implications for violence is in 2018, there was a costume company called Yandy that had a sexy Handmaid's Tale costume. And it was pulled immediately because people are like, you are promoting the subjugation of women. This isn't okay. Like, subjugation isn't sexy. It was pulled immediately and they issued an apology. Their sexy caricatures of Indigenous women were only removed after a full year, and they were quietly removed with no public acknowledgement. So fictional white women have more respect than actual Indigenous people who are being affected by these caricatures, by this idea of the sexy Native princess for the white man. Next, I want to talk about trans women of color and the fetishization that they experience. So trans women of color live at the intersections of race and trans misogyny. And Usher et al., which was a 2020 study, theorizes that trans women of color are sexually objectified based on race, class, and gender. And ultimately, trans women of color are sexually objectified as a woman, as a person of color, a queer person, and a trans person. So a lot of what we've already talked about is being compounded in one person's experience. They may be experiencing multiple of these, the violence of fetishization in a way that perhaps other identities are not. And trans women of color are also more likely to be assaulted in the public eye because they too are seen as a legitimate victim, not in need of intervention due to the unrapeable nature of women of color and particularly Black women. And as trans women stepping outside what are deemed normative gender roles. So trans women often experience public violence, and because we as a society view them as threatening the status quo, that violence is very rarely challenged, and that really leads to the epidemic rates of the death of and specifically the murder of Black trans women within the United States. And passing also often leads to safety from the high rates of sexual violence that trans women are subjected to by a society that views their authentic selves as a threat to the status quo. But then this is also fraught because if you are found out to be passing, oftentimes you are given the stereotype of like the trans deceiver, and then you are still subjected to sexual violence as a way to put you back into place, right, by society. This is a mechanism to keep people in the roles that society, white supremacy, all of the isms need them to be in to continue moving forward. And I just really want to mention here that this is really what this trans fetishization is something that all trans people experience, but for trans women of color, you're hyper visible in at least 2 arenas. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So fetish porn. Before I dive into this, I really want to say that I'm not anti-porn. I think porn can be a wonderful tool and a wonderful way to explore your sexuality. But I really want to talk about the effects of fetish porn and how that plays out specifically on the internet. And if you're interested in learning more about ethical porn production, we have an event tomorrow, and I'll put that in the chat. So internet porn is often stripped of context. So we're often not seeing negotiation scenes due to the popularity of free sites like Pornhub and like Xvideo. And in particular, Fritz et al. In 2021, in a study called Worse Than Objects, the depiction of Black women and men and their sexual relationship in pornography, found that Black women receive aggression at a higher rate than white women in porn, specifically more likely to be spanked. And really hearkening back to, I think, Maxine's and Professor Mejia's presentations with this obsession with the Black butt. And Black men are also significantly more likely to be the aggressor in scenes and less likely to kiss a sexual partner. So this is all to say, I'm not suggesting that pornography is causing the death and the death of Black women. What instead we're suggesting is that the sexual scripts of higher levels of aggression in pornography against Black women creates a societal context that devalues Black female bodies, putting Black women at higher risk for death by an intimate partner than other groups of women. And when you're also looking at fetish porn through a limited lens, depending on who's the director and who is actually consuming it, the harmful effect of stereotypes of Black women and men may be even stronger in the absence of real world experience with people of color. We still live in a pretty segregated society, and if fetish porn is your only context in which you have seen people of color, you may actually take on those very specific sexual scripts in a video as fact, as society. And we've seen how this plays out. And so that brings us to the case of Rose Kalemba, who's an Indigenous girl who was raped at the age of 14. And the video, she was actually gang raped, and the video ended up on Pornhub, essentially immortalizing her rape. And so this is really what I want to challenge with internet porn, is that oftentimes with these free sites, anyone can upload, and we're also losing a lot of context. For instance, in a lot of fetish porn, there's like a pre-interview where you learn about the person, why they want to do this, and that they actually enjoy this kind of kink. We're losing a lot of that, and we're teaching people that it is as it is without context. And so what this is ultimately leading to is that actual rapes are being uploaded to Pornhub, to Xvideo, and people are consuming that, what they may think is a sexual fantasy, which is actually an act of sexual violence that is then immortalized and replayed and replayed and replayed. It's really important to mention here as well that oftentimes when Rose Kalemba's rape is re-uploaded to Pornhub, it will enact things like sexy native princess and really enact some of these fetish terms to a video of her actual rape, of her actual assault. I also just want to mention here that porn also has effects on the people who it's about, right? Like, so fetish porn has effects for the people who share that identity and are viewing it, right? So there are definitely mental health effects. And the study also suggested that this idea that Black men don't kiss their sexual partners, they very rarely kiss their Black sexual partners, but then they never kiss their white women sexual partners, is also a way that we can really see fetishization playing out, making Black men seem as though they are only good for one thing and that they're incapable of intimacy and connection and loving relationships, which harkens all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and how he wrote about Black relationships. And then some contemporary examples are the people versus Brock Turner. So Brock Turner is the rapist from the Stanford case. You probably have heard about it. He was caught assaulting someone who was then known as Emily Doe and is now known to us as Chanel Miller behind a dumpster. I believe there was 2 witnesses and there was really no question about whether or not he had done it. He, at the discretion of a judge, got 6 months sentencing and in reality was released 3 months early and only served 3 months. So even when Chanel Miller was revealed to be a biracial Chinese and white woman, this sentencing didn't surprise me. So it's in my opinion that even when you're not actively engaging in fetishization yourself, you are still being impacted by the rhetoric of fetishization. To me, the judge who gave Brock Turner 6 months saw himself more in Brock Turner than in Chanel Miller because of that tactic of dehumanization that comes with fetishization. And so even though we have, again, removed explicit racism from our laws, the way that they're actually being enforced is still quite the same. And I also really see this with the March 26 Atlanta shootings, where the officer who had, he was like the spokesperson for the event, he said that the shooter had a very bad day. And to me, that really invokes it really shows that fetishization has impacted him, whether he wants to believe it or not, whether or not he feels he has a fetish surrounding Asian women to begin with, because at the very least, he's buying into the dehumanization aspect. He's buying into the homogenization and flattening. So this is also a picture of Brock Turner. And then this is just a tweet that I think really sums up how I think a lot of us feel about and know about the March 26 Atlanta shootings, which is that racial preferences are and will always be violent. That man didn't have a preference for Asian women because he thought they were extra pretty. It was a legacy of Western imperialism, hypersexualizing Asian women and removing their agency. It's the same shit across the board. And so we don't have time for this, but I do want to show that this video, so look it up. I'm a dominatrix that teaches Black feminist theory. And then do you think it is possible to reclaim fetishization and subvert it? It's a good video. And then here are my sources. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Em. I'd like to hand the floor over to Jessica Reeves. And once again, if you have any questions or comments during the presentations, you're welcome to privately chat them to me.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today. That was so fascinating. I'm sure everyone agrees. And I am the editorial director at ADL's Center on Extremism. And I focus specifically on misogyny as it manifests in different extremist movements, and specifically the world of white supremacy. And what I'm going to do today is just walk you through a little bit of a outline of the misogyny that we so frequently see online and how that overlaps again with racism and the white supremacist construct that we all operate within, unfortunately. I'm gonna share my screen here. Hoping everyone can see that.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we at ADL talk about violent misogyny. A couple of years ago, I wrote a report that looked at the intersection of the alt-right specifically and the way they talked about women and the misogynist online manosphere, which I know many of you are probably very familiar with, unfortunately. I'm going to get a little bit more into what the manosphere consists of in a moment. But since the publication of this report in 2018, we started to look more carefully and more closely at how misogyny really has an interplay with so many extremist movements, right-wing extremist movements in particular. And when we talk about misogyny, it's a really important, it's not just how it intersects with extremism as we've defined it, but it's important to look at misogyny as an element, as extremism itself. And this is something that I feel really strongly about, and that I know many others on this call do as well. So I want to talk a little bit about, again, this manosphere that we started to look at. And I want to say that from the report, we said, ADL considers misogyny a dangerous and underestimated component of extremism, and this report marks the start of an ongoing effort to investigate the ways in which people in the white supremacist, incel, and MRA orbits feed and inform one another's poisonous hatred of women. So also from the report, and this kind of underpins the entire concept behind this presentation, there is a robust symbiosis between misogyny and white supremacy. The two ideologies are powerfully intertwined. While not all misogynists are racists, and not every white supremacist is a misogynist, a deep-seated loathing of women acts as a connective tissue between many white supremacists, especially those on the alt-right, and their lesser known brothers in hate, like incels, involuntary celibates, MRAs, men's rights activists, and PUAs, known as pickup artists. So the report that we published looked at the primarily online world known as the manosphere. So we'll start with the MRAs, the men's rights activists. They believe that men are being victimized by feminism and by women's efforts to gain equal treatment under the law. And this began as a relatively mainstream response to second wave feminism in the 1970s. Originally, they were much more connected with fathers' rights and men's rights groups. And then you'd see them in the workplace and in divorce courts arguing that men were being shafted in various ways. And in recent years, they've become much more extreme and something very different from what they started as. MRAs are very much in the news these days. You probably are all familiar with Roy Den Hollander, who's pictured here, the self-described anti-feminist lawyer who opened fire on Judge Esther Salas's family. This was last year. The shooting left Salas's son dead and her husband in critical condition. Hollander built much of his career around objectifying and demeaning women and holding up white men as the ultimate victims in American society. We then get to the PUAs, or the pickup artists. So in 2005, a journalist named Neil Strauss published a book called The Game, which became a bestseller. It detailed the demeaning ways in which men, including Strauss himself, treated women they found attractive. Online, a man who goes by Roosh V is the original PUA. He has published guides on teaching men how to improvise and improve and enhance their game. This group embraces psychological warfare against women. Treat them badly, insult them, and eventually they'll come around and go on a date with you. They trade tips on how to beat rape kits and the best drinks for covering up the taste of roofies. And I do want to talk also about specifically racialized misogyny. The Atlanta spa shootings were the perfect epitomization of this. Racialized misogyny is a nexus for white supremacy and violent sexism. Women of color experience so much racialized misogyny that's specific to their community. Black women and Asian women, for example, experience different iterations of violence and misogyny based on pervasive racial stereotypes. The March 2021 Atlanta shootings, which left 8 people dead, were explicitly layered. The women who were murdered were targeted because they were Asian and because they were women. It's impossible to ignore the element of religious chauvinism and gendered violence reflected in the perpetrator's statement about sex and shame and the objectification and dehumanization of these women as a, quote, temptation he felt compelled to eliminate. These themes are echoed repeatedly throughout the manosphere and throughout this presentation. So our next stop is the incels, or involuntary celibates. Incels are heterosexual men who blame women and society for their lack of success in dating and sex. Some have become violent in recent years. The term incel was actually coined in 1993 by a woman, a young Canadian academic who intended the community to be a place where lonely people could find each other and share stories and hopefully help each other cope. Today, the movement is almost entirely male, and the rare women who visit incel forums to talk about their own involuntary celibacy are usually attacked and threatened until they leave. The first known incel attack predates the coining of the term and was committed in 1989 by Marc Lépine, who murdered 14 women and wounded 10 women and 4 men at Montreal's École Polytechnique. Lépine was vocal in his hatred of feminists who, quote, ruined his life, according to his suicide note. In December of 2019, Canadian authorities arrested a man who planned to celebrate the anniversary of Lépine's violence by carrying out a similar attack. He wrote online that feminism is a cancer and that, quote, every woman is a potential enemy. Law enforcement estimate there are between 1,000 and 10,000 active incels in the United States. This is an incredibly unhelpful number, which we have pointed out many times. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to figure out who is, quote, active, who is subscribing to the ideology, who is shit posting on various incel forums, who is being ironic, et cetera, et cetera. So we just have absolutely no way of knowing exactly how many active incels there are. And it is important to note that there are incels who exist peacefully, share their feelings about women, which generally speaking are extremely negative, but do not act on them. But these incel forums remain a cesspool of misogyny and violent talk about women. So some of the most recent incel attacks, these all happened in 2020. May of 2020, Armando Hernandez Jr. drove to the Westgate Entertainment District near Phoenix, Arizona. He loaded 3 30-round magazines for his AR-15 rifle and started a video live stream as he stepped out of his car. "Let's get this done, guys," he said. By the time the police apprehended Hernandez, he had shot 3 people, none fatally. He targeted couples, prosecutors say, because he was angry at his lack of romantic success with women. And he self-identified as an incel during cross-examinations. Just a month later, a man named Cole Carini appeared in a Virginia emergency room. He was missing a hand and several fingers from his other hand and was covered in shrapnel wounds. Investigators who searched his home found bomb-making materials and writing describing a young man who goes to a mall to target, quote, hot cheerleaders with, quote, deadly objects. So that was an attack that was foiled. Another attack that was foiled very recently, this was this year. In April, authorities arrested Malik Sanchez for allegedly perpetrating a hoax bomb threat at a Manhattan restaurant in February. According to the criminal complaint, Sanchez self-identified as an incel. He posted a video in February 2021 captioned, "Incel Army Rise Up," which shows him yelling at 2 women walking in Manhattan that he has, quote, incel rage and supports Elliot Rodger, who we'll get to in a moment, saying Rodger's victims, quote, deserve to be run over and hit by a truck. They deserve to be slaughtered. In March 2021, Sanchez posted a second video showing himself approaching women, announcing his support for incels and Rodger while making gun hand gestures. I want to just talk a little bit more about incels, particularly how the qualifications and sort of characterizations of incels overlaps with a lot of the racial stereotypes that we see. We don't know that much for sure about incels. We know that They are primarily online subculture. We know that they are, the stereotype is that they're not particularly social, so that the online forum situation suits them well. But incels remain a bit of a mystery. We don't know that much about them. What drives them? How do they think about themselves? And these poll results, which were posted last year on incels.co, which is probably the most popular incel forum, gives us a glimpse into the demographics and the mindset of these men. So keeping in mind that these are self-reported and non-specific results, of the 550 respondents, roughly 38% were from North America and 45% were from Europe. So incels represent something of a departure from the rest of the manosphere in the sense that their rage is slightly less racialized than that expressed by other groups. And incels are usually assumed to be white, and certainly the majority of those who have acted violently have been Caucasian. The community writ large, however, appears to be significantly more diverse. While the majority of poll respondents were white, a substantial number did identify as non-white. And there are a couple of dozen questions in the survey, and some of the responses powerfully illustrate the psychology of incels. The survey asks, have you ever seriously considered suicide? About 68% said yes. Have you considered plastic surgery for purely aesthetic improvement? 60% said yes. As it happens, of course, some incels don't just want to harm themselves via suicide or plastic surgery. Some turn that violence against the world and against women in particular. One of these violent incels spurred us to write our 2018 report. In April of 2018, Alec Manassian drove a rented van onto a crowded Toronto sidewalk, killing 10 people, most of whom were women. He wrote the post seen here to signal his intentions to his online incel community and to show allegiance to fellow incel Elliot Rodger. In March 2021, the Ontario Superior Court found Manassian guilty on multiple charges of murder. He now faces life in prison. You all may remember Scott Beerley in Tallahassee. He entered a yoga studio and shot, wounding 5 people, killing 2 women. He died on the scene from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And he had actually posted a huge number of really racist and misogynistic comments and posts online. And it became very evident very quickly that he was both incredibly racist and a misogynist. This is Elliot Rodger. He is sort of the uber incel, and it's impossible to overstate his influence when you're talking about the world of incels. He has a cult-like influence on many incels, and it comes up very frequently on the incel message boards. So in May 2014, Rodger opened fire near the campus of UC Santa Barbara. Shortly before his rampage, he posted a lengthy manifesto and video blaming women for his unhappiness and referring to himself as the Supreme Gentleman. His attack left 6 people dead and 14 other people wounded. He shot himself in his car after committing the attacks. He has since served as inspiration for a number of incel attacks. Alec Manassian and Scott Beerley both name-checked Rodger. He is cited frequently on incel message boards as ER, as in, I'm going to pull an ER one of these days. So it's important to note that while the manosphere communities exist as separate entities, their misogyny serves as a powerful connector. We see this happening in real time. Pickup artists' hatred of women leads them to incel message boards and vice versa. The same pattern happens among men's rights activists. This slide shows a prime example of that crossover. Here, Rush V, who we mentioned before as the king of the pickup artists, explains Manassian's deadly attack with typically misogynist logic. Women could have saved themselves if only they'd had sex with Manassian when they'd had a chance. So Rush V wrote, Alec Manassian wouldn't have killed people with a van if the media had not inoculated him and other lonely men against effective game teachers like myself. Sleeping with only 2 or 3 Toronto Tinder sluts would have been enough to stop his urge to kill. So again, the victim blaming goes on, and we get to the incel glossary. I'm going to go really quickly through these. I suspect many of you are already familiar with these terms. If you're not, I'm happy to send this to you after the fact. Black pill is a nihilistic worldview adopted by the incel community. So the idea is things are too far gone. The only way out is to destroy everything, burn it all down, and start from scratch. Chad is this idea of the archetypical anti-incel, so a white, straight man with Aryan features and other desirable physical traits. Stacy's are the women that incels want to date, but who only want to date Chads. Okay. So incel forums, much like the rest of the manosphere, are littered with misogyny, from insults to posters flat out encouraging each other to rape and kill women. Women are referred to as foids, as in femoids, as in not human. Incels believe that women's sexuality is a weapon that they wield cold-heartedly over all men. Many of the posts reflect deep self-loathing or other expressions of despair. We often think of message boards as being supportive places where people can find community. And there's certainly a community to be found, but it's a community that responds with vitriol and nihilism rather than hope. These guys applaud and lionize suicidal and homicidal impulses. Roger, Beerley, and Manassian are all heroes here. So this next slide is an indicator of how women are dehumanized, how they are turned into essentially symbols, the fetishization of virginity, the fetishization of certain physical attributes is so prevalent on these incel message boards, on the pickup artist message boards. So here an incel is describing his perfect girl. So she has to be white, she has to be around my age, 22, at least a 5 out of a 10, and that's his subjective measure of attractiveness. She has to be a virgin, she can't be tall or short, she doesn't dress like a slut, she can't be a feminist or a vegan or a commie or any of that shit. She has to be in good shape, smart for being a female. She can't be interested in video games, sports, or other male-only hobbies, and she can't have many friends. So you can see how there's this idea that there is this prototypical woman that they're all waiting for, and that every other woman falls short, and that becomes the woman's fault. So it's this cycle of blame, it's this cycle of anger, and it's this cycle of vitriol that tends to turn outward onto the women that they encounter. So this dehumanizing and idealized version of womanhood is perpetuated not only in the manosphere, but also in the world of white supremacy. So this is a typical post on a white supremacist message board. Men prefer debt-free virgins without tattoos. Again, there's this idea that women can only fit into a certain, they have to be a certain type in order to be valuable, in order to be important, in order to be worth the respect of white supremacists. And again, if you are respected by a white supremacist, then you've obviously done something very wrong in your life, but also you are going to be limited in the amount of movement and freedom that you have. So warning against that, if in case that's a, something that comes up for anyone. So all of this takes us back to the crux of this report. So beyond dissecting the very weird and often horrifying misogyny that exists on the manosphere, our research also connects the dots between white supremacy and misogyny. The two ideologies are closely interwoven and they feed seamlessly into one another. So that connection manifests itself in a number of ways. And this is just one example of the increasingly anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant and racist screeds that we're seeing on incel message boards. So these posters are talking about an election. They're saying, teehee, don't forget to vote Goyim. And that's a white supremacist code word for what white supremacists believe Jewish people are calling all non-Jews. So it's this idea they're signaling that they think that there's a Jewish supremacy that is controlling all the elections. So they talk about New York City, they talk about all these Jewish, all of these Jewish candidates that they don't want to vote for. And they're using the echo symbol, which is 3 parentheses on either side of a word. And that is a way that white supremacists initially started to identify people that they thought were Jewish, or that had some sort of connection to, quote, Jewish control. And you'll notice that a lot of Jewish journalists and academics especially on Twitter, have started to, or have reclaimed the parentheses and the echo symbol. So putting them around their own names as sort of a defiant note against this. Here you have this other poster saying elections are scams that allow for mass immigration and female supremacy. So again, there's these conspiracy theories. The world is out to get them. Everything is, geared against these poor men who are suffering deeply because of women and immigrants. So I'm sure it will not surprise anyone to learn that much of the white supremacist world is inherently sexist, just like the manosphere. And white supremacists hold hugely retrograde ideas about women and their place in the world. Women are expected to be cheerful incubators for white warrior babies and to take good care of their race warrior husbands. They are expected to be morally unimpeachable and to be virgins before marriage. So this was found on a white supremacist message board pretty recently. Your freedom has brought white people and our land nothing but hardship. You whores are sieving our entire race because you wanted to sleep with Chad for a night and have one of his criminal bastard genes and then pretend to have a career instead of going for a breadwinner and breeding 6 warriors while being a happy housefrau. And you'll note the use of the term Chad, which goes back to the incel terminology. So here you start to see, again, this mixing of these two misogynist ideologies sort of coming together and using terms interchangeably. So there's a lot of talk about how women have to be a certain way in order to be perfect, in order to be acceptable to these men who clearly hate women. So you sort of wonder what the point of it is. But no matter how perfect a woman might appear to be, she is never quite good enough. And this is from the Daily Stormer, a neo-Nazi website. The fact is, when you give women rights, they destroy absolutely everything around them, no matter what other variable is involved. Even if you become the ultimate alpha male, some stupid bitch will still ruin your life. And that's Andrew Anglin, the founder of Daily Stormer and one of the most grotesque people online. And I know that's saying a lot. But like all white supremacists, Anglin believes that his place in the world is being threatened by non-white people. As a misogynist, he also believes his place in the world is being threatened by women. He epitomizes the ease with which these men leap between one iteration of victimhood to another. And victimhood, as we know, can quickly turn into aggression. On a range of misogynist message board, we've tracked an escalation of language. It starts with women are weak or less than. Women are not as capable. Women are stealing jobs and opportunities from men. Women should stay in their place. And then you get all the way up to women deserve to be raped and locked in cages. And that's once again from Andrew Anglin. And we see the same escalation of language when posters on white supremacist message boards discuss non-white people. The fact is that women's very existence is troubling to a lot of these men, and their efforts to achieve parity in pay, in the workplace, in politics is a popular punching bag. So this is an article, what I'm showing now is an article from the Washingtonian magazine that posted in May of 2019. It was an anonymous essay by a mom who talked about how her son found his way very quickly from sort of, quote, light misogyny online into the full-on alt-right and white supremacy. And she wrote about it really compellingly. And the son, who apparently has extricated himself successfully, is now free and clear. He seems to be back to normal. But he talked about how easy it was to find all of these things online, how quickly the algorithm fed him towards all of this really increasingly horrific content. So it's just something that I recommend if people are interested in how this all proceeds and how it can happen really quickly. I think it's just a really interesting point if you have any young people in your life, beyond yourselves, of course. People often ask me, well, what can we do about these issues? I always talk about how, law enforcement needs to be reformed in every single conceivable way, including the way they deal with racialized and gendered violence. And we need them to understand that these things need to be taken seriously, that threats cannot be dismissed as locker room talk. That's of utmost importance. We can advocate for policy that addresses misogyny and gender-based crimes in a meaningful way. We have to ensure that our hate crimes laws include gender-based crimes. We have to combat cyber-related bullying and stalking. And we need to make sure that sexual assault legislation and victim services are properly addressed and propped up and funded. And that is it for me. So I will stop sharing and hand it back to Asha.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Alrighty, so we've concluded the presentation, so we're going to move into the Q&A portion. So if you would like to have your video on, you're welcome